And for more on China's military reform and the latest movement on the military front, we're joined here in the Beijing studio by two panelists, Mr. Ye Hailin, who is a researcher at the National Institute of International Strategy with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and also Mr. Zhang Junshe from the China Naval Research Institute. Meanwhile, in Newton, we have Robert Ross, professor of political science at Boston College. He's also an associate at John King Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard University. Last but not least, we have in Washington, D.C., in the United States, Greg Poling, who is a director of the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Gentlemen, for all of you, very strong panel. Welcome to our program. What do you make, first of all, from the Chinese military's perspective, of the recent step by the Chinese President Xi Jinping to have this, what he calls the new Joint Forces Battle Command Center? What is the function of it? How is that compared to the previous China's army system, or military system, shall I say?
Well, now he sits there as the commander-in-chief of the PRA forces, and also the commander-in-chief of the Combat Command Center. Actually, previously, all the presidents or the Secretary General also of the party have been the commander-in-chief because these people have been the chairmen of the CMC. So now I think that we will strengthen the joint combat command capabilities of the PRA.
Mr. Ross, though, what do you make of it, Professor Ross, of this latest development from the Chinese side? And what kind of signal is it sending in a way about China's military way forward?
I think it's clear this is one more step in the development of the Chinese Navy. China's ground borders, its frontiers have never been more secure. The need to continue large investments in the Army is diminishing, and the budget of the Navy is growing. But unlike in the past, the Navy is dependent on advanced communication technologies to be able to operate for command, control, and communication. That means satellites, that means interoperability, it means jointness. In addition, it means being able to operate with the Air Force, because support for the Air Force, air support for the Navy is critical for naval operations. So we're seeing jointness become part of the Chinese Navy, Chinese Army's doctrine. This will go forward as the Chinese Navy continues to expand its operations in the Western Pacific, the East China Sea, the South China Sea.
How shall we, Mr. Ye, sitting in Beijing, understand the relations between the new development on this front, as we mentioned, also analyzed by the two previous speakers, and the apparent crisis, territorial disputes going on in the South China Sea, East China Sea, as well as China's international responsibilities when it comes to the military?
Just like most of the other countries, almost all the countries' military doctrine is based on their task and threat. But there's to be accurate, there's only one country. Their military doctrine is not based on their threat. It's based on the capacity. This is America, it's not China. But for China, of course, this military doctrine is based on threat and the task. So we can clearly notice that since the 2014, Chinese maritime security issue get more important and more crucial. So that's why the reason Chinese military system and the military doctrine had to make some update and reform to suitable for the new change of the maritime issue. So I think this Russ is correct. All the reform is based on the task, what you want to do, and you have to based on it to reshape the whole structure.
Right.
And also this structure is follow the modernization process of the PRA.
Mr. Poling, hearing it from the United States, what does it mean for the U.S. Navy and also U.S. International responsibility as well as Asia Pacific vision if you have a stronger Navy from China?
Well, I think there's two competing narratives there. One is as the Chinese Navy takes over greater and greater responsibilities, as it steps out more into the region, we're seeing an understandable spike in competition in the near waters, the East China Sea and the South China Sea. At the same time, the U.S. does welcome the role of the Chinese Navy as it becomes a real blue water Navy abroad in places like off the coast of Somalia and anti-piracy operations. And we're going to continue to see those two competing impetuses, I think, for years to come.
All right, very brief answers from our American guest. So let me come back to you, also from the Navy, Mr. Zhang here in Beijing. China's military building, if our American guest is not mentioning it, I have to mention it because it is being used, at least that phrase, in some international media reports, suggesting it could be China aggression in the neighboring water surrounding China toward the other countries. Is that going to be the case? What kind of capabilities is Chinese Navy developing right now? What are their tasks, as being mentioned by Mr. Ye, who is, of course, coming from the civilian side?
Well, I think they are true in some aspect because of most of the threats China is facing come from the sea. And second, most of the international obligations and duties also come from the sea. We can see this from the joint anti-piracy and escort operations the Chinese Navy has been conducting since 2008 in the Gulf of Aden and waters of Somalia. And in the future, I think the Chinese Navy should develop its capabilities in two directions. One is commensurate with the status of China as an international power, and also we should have the ability to safeguard national sovereignty, security, and development interests. On the other hand, we should develop the capabilities to conduct remote operations in the overseas to carry out more international responsibilities and duties as the anti-piracy operations.
On safeguarding China's sovereignty, earlier we have already talked briefly with Mr. Ye in Beijing about the territorial disputes in the South China Sea and East China Sea. What would that mean, the increasing capability of the Chinese Navy in terms of supporting China in its sovereignty debate with other countries? How does the geopolitical, political debates work together with China's military advancement?
Well, I think one of the priorities of the Chinese Navy is to safeguarding national security. But concerning the East China Sea and South China Sea disputes, I think China has been exercising great restraint in using military strength, either in the East China Sea or in the South China Sea. We haven't sent our naval forces to join the control or join the joint patrols with the Coast Guard. And we, of course, the Navy stands there as a backbone for the Coast Guard. But the Coast Guard and civilian vessels are in the front to deal with the issues and disputes between China and the other countries. I think this is the best way for us to handle, to resolve such issues.
Mr. Ross, would you agree?
Yes, I would. And to comment on your observation that some observers have thought that China is behaving aggressively or belligerently, I think we should understand that this is to be expected behavior from a rising power who looks at its maritime security as problematic. As Chinese leaders have now said, China has two objectives: to defend its sovereignty and maintain stability, something China could not have done before. And of course, U.S. dominance of Chinese coastal waters is a problem for China. Having said that, this nonetheless creates a conflict of interest between the United States and China. Just because China wants more doesn't mean that's good for the United States. So the dilemma for the two countries is how to manage a conflict of interest while maintaining stability and cooperation. And admittedly, this has been difficult for both sides. As Xi Jinping had said, defend sovereignty, maintain stability, but stability has been a problem. For the United States, maintain its presence, maintain the balance, reassure its allies, but maintain cooperation with China, this too has been difficult. This all reflects rising China, new capabilities, conflicts of interest, which neither side is very accustomed to. So this will be a challenge going forward, as we can expect the Chinese Navy to become more powerful and the challenges to become greater.
Of course, this is coming from the academic and civilian side from the U.S., but what about from the military side? Even though you are an academic yourself, Mr. Pauling, but I'm sure you've got some military background yourself as well. So having heard what Mr. Ross has articulated for us, what would be the appropriate strategies then, you think, from the U.S. Navy and also from the U.S. military side when you have a rising power, eager to maintain stability and also protect its water sovereignty, at least as they believe so?
Right, well, so the U.S. is already responding. I mean, we've seen a lot about the plans to move eventually 60% of total U.S. naval strength into the Pacific, including the most advanced, the largest of our surface ships, our subs, et cetera. The same with the Air Force, boosting U.S. air capability in the Asia Pacific. All of this in preparation for the day that hopefully never comes when we do see Chinese Navy used out front in these disputes. But here and now, the problem for the U.S. is really how to respond, given that the Chinese Navy is not the one out in front. It is primarily the Coast Guard and the Chinese maritime militias that are out there. I wouldn't say necessarily aggression, but bullying Southeast Asian claimants, in which the U.S. Navy cannot respond forcefully in what is effectively a law enforcement activity or dispute between China and Southeast Asian partners. So it is often left sitting on the sidelines, presenting perhaps a deterrent by putting U.S. naval ships just over the horizon, so to speak. It ensures that Chinese naval ships also stay over the horizon. But that leaves it to the much larger, much more advanced Chinese Coast Guard and civilian vessels to run right over their smaller Southeast Asian partners.
May I also follow up a little bit, if Mr. Pauling, you allow me, which is, what will be the function then coming from the Pentagon, for example, when you have the flying over of the U.S. planes and also the military ships in the territory that China believes at least have a territorial dispute case with some of the neighboring countries? What will be the function of that? And also, is that already part of the very strategic thinking of the U.S. Navy and U.S. military, or it's only a sporadic, a temporary response? Should there be a systematic approach?
Well, I think there is a systematic approach, and the so-called freedom of navigation operations that you're alluding to are part of that, but just one small part. The U.S. does not have an interest in the territorial disputes, whether in the East China Sea or South China Sea. It does not particularly care who has sovereignty over which reef or which islet.
Right.
It does have an interest in the maritime disputes. It sees itself as a defender of international law, and it sees China's actions and claims in the South China Sea especially as contrary to the international law. Regardless of who controls the islands, China's making claims to the waters that are very excessive, that are not based in international law as the U.S. sees it. And the purpose of these operations is simply to assert that by the U.S., for instance, sailing or operating near artificial islands. It's saying that under international law, it does not see any claim from them.
All right, Mr. Ye, respond first of all. And secondly, how does China see these approaches coming from the United States? Have China responded correctly, at least according to you, from the civilian side?
The first question is who make the situation worse and who has to respond to it? There's a
there's a lot of questions.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions, and China and the U.S. has a fully different understanding that who shoot the first shot. But secondly, this might also be my point. Yeah, America also emphasized that there's the international law. There's not pick up the side of the sovereignty dispute. But for the record, for the last 40 years, a lot of the Chinese neighboring country, on the water, they do the same thing China did right now, but the American remain silent. So it's really difficult for China to accept such kind of the opinion that America has no opinion over the territorial dispute. So in Chinese understanding that this freedom navigation is targeting on China, so that China has to make the response. So this question go back to our first question, that who has to respond to the other side?
Okay, well, Mr. Ye has very passionately raised more questions than answering the questions. But let me go to you, Senior Colonel Zhang. What do you say about the U.S. approach as a result? Has China got, at this moment, with this Joint Command Center, a systematic approach as to how it wants to align all of these civilian forces together with the military and also particular Navy to safeguard a sovereignty. What does that mean for Navy's growth in this country?
Well, I think the streamline of these military organizations, the focus of that is to strengthen our joint combat command capabilities, because we have now the joint combat command system, which runs from the CMC to the 5 battle zones and to the troops.
Right.
In this way, we can shorten the time process between the highest command to the lowest level of troops, and this can improve the proficiency in fighting.
All right. Professor Ross, I have to come back to you. You've been attentively listened to your 3 other colleagues, and you have been an China hand in the United States for decades. Taiwan issue, U.S.-China relations, now South China Sea, and many others. What would you say? Do you see a clear-cut plans coming from both militaries? And how do you see the interactions among these militaries, the 2 of them, these days, with the latest development from China?
I think the trend in both militaries is to respond to pressure, respond to constraint with more assertiveness. So as the United States puts pressure on China from freedom of navigation cruises, from sailing close and flying close to Chinese installations, opposing Chinese land building in the South China Sea, China pushes back stronger. And when China pushes its claims to the South China Sea and builds its islands, the United States Navy pushes back stronger. So we're in this cycle, we're in this escalatory cycle where neither side is exercising restraint, and it's not clear that the political interests of the 2 countries, the interests in cooperation and stability, have a role to play thus far in how we're responding to each other's initiatives. So it's very important at this time for both sides to ask themselves, where can we exercise restraint? Where can we not push back against the other? Where can we make a concession or ease our activities so as to reassure the other that they're not bent on expansion or resistance? Thus far, neither side has signaled an interest in that. We're, of course, going to have a challenge coming up soon with the court resolution or the court response to the Philippine claims. And should that go against China, there will be some pressure on both sides to ease that tension, and it's not clear how they'll respond.
Is this a concession issue, or is this a principle issue, Mr. Ye?
Well, that is to say we have an international court opinion coming up.
All right.
And should the ruling go against China, the Chinese themselves may feel the need to substantiate their claim, and the Americans may feel the need to support the Philippines.
All right.
Once again, we'll be in this position of each side putting pressure on the other.
That is already a big scenario over there. Mr. Ye, immediate scenario, in fact, an immediate response?
I think it's still a little bit early to say this a principal issue. I think there's still, for both of countries, have some space room to make some concession.
Mr. Zhang?
I think first, I want to say that the South China Sea issue is an issue between China and some of the ASEAN countries, not an issue between China and the United States. And the United States doesn't have need to meddle in this area, and it needn't send its warships to this area. It just provokes tensions in this area. So the root cause of tensions now in the South China Sea is the United States, who sent its military warships and aircraft to this area.
Okay, and final words from you, Mr. Pauling, issue of concession or issue of principle? What's next between the military and the political side? Political side said, we need to move forward about the bilateral relations. Can the militaries follow?
I think both militaries are showing restraint in that neither of them are coming to blows out there, but the fact is that we do have 2 principles that so far are diametrically opposed. The U.S. is not willing to cede this question of international law, and China's not willing to cede its claims in the South China Sea. Until one of those sides changes, we're going to be in this trajectory.